and welcome to day 3 of the Mindful Living Summit. I'm Ann Alexander, and I'm the Content Director for Mindful, and I'll be your host for this session. I am thrilled to be here today with Tara Brach. We are going to explore the theme of compassion, working with emotions, and connecting with others. Tara is a PhD, a clinical psychologist, an internationally known teacher of mindfulness meditation, and the author of the best-selling Radical Acceptance and True Refuge. She's also the new author of Radical Compassion. Tara also has a podcast that gets 2 million downloads a month that explores the role of mindfulness in the realization of human potential. In addition to her public teaching, Tara is active in bringing meditation to the Washington, D.C. area, schools and prisons and underserved populations. So Tara, thank you so much for being here today.
I'm delighted to be joining you.
We have a lot of questions, so we're just going to jump in, if that's okay. So you have a new book out. It's called Radical Compassion, Learning to Love Yourself and Your Work with the Practice of Rain. So let's just get started. I'd love to ask you, what is radical compassion and what is rain?
So the word compassion is a kind of mushy one, like love. The reason I describe this as radical compassion is it refers to the full-blown or mature kind of version of compassion. And what I mean by that, there's a few qualities that make compassion mature. One of them is that it's embodied, that we're awake and mindful in our bodies. Because when we're compassionate and we're not embodied, it's more abstract, it's not heartfelt. Another quality of mature compassion is that it's an active kind of caring. We really want to help. It's not passive. And the third that feels really important is that it's all-inclusive, that I'm not just feeling compassion for a best friend, but that compassion has the capacity to really include all beings. So radical compassion feels like what we need in the world, and it is all-inclusive because we so often push others out of our heart. Rain is a mindfulness-based meditation that awakens compassion and brings it to where we're in emotional difficulty. So the beauty of rain is it's simple. It's a 4-step process, and it's pretty easy to remember that when we get stuck and when we get reactive, we can move through these steps, bringing mindfulness and compassion to what's going on inside us in a way that untangles tangles and frees us. And the steps, I'll just name them really briefly so all of our listeners are on the same page. The R of rain, this acronym, is recognize. Say you're afraid, recognize fear. The A is allow it, not to push it away or try to fix it or ignore it or judge it. Just allow it, just let it be there. The I of rain is to investigate, and that means mindfully bringing the attention into the body. It's not so much a cognitive investigation, it's more somatic, where we really are becoming intimate with and contacting what's going on in our bodies and sensing what the vulnerability in us needs from us. And the N, nurture, is offering what's needed, offering the care that's needed to what's going on in our bodies. Rain ends in what I call after the rain, which are the moments where we recognize the kind of presence that's really emerged and sense the difference between when we started, that kind of trapped sense of self, and more of the freedom, the not being identified as a fearful self, and more resting in an open and kind presence. So that's the steps of rain. And even though they're simple in a way, Anne, the reality is that each person has to customize it because there's many, many nuances, which is why I wrote the book, because we can know those steps, but to really bring it to all the different kinds of challenges we face and to do it in a way that's compelling and impactful, we need to really experiment with what works for us. I mean, the gift is really healing, really finding freedom in the face of emotional difficulty.
So can you talk about that healing? Because what I would love to understand is when somebody, let's just take an emotion, let's just take a common emotion with mindful, and a lot of people come to mindfulness because they're feeling anxious, and we have those racing thoughts. Can you just walk me through, maybe if you don't mind, maybe it's your own adaptation? Because one of the things I loved about the book, your book Radical Compassion, was you shared your own sort of struggles and your own ability, or your own sort of penchant, if you will, to get into your own sort of anxious thoughts. And so can you just walk me through, like, how do you personally go through a rain practice, and where do you wind up at the end, and how does that feel healing for you?
Sure. You mentioned anxiety. One of the kind of currents through my life that I've noticed is getting anxious about being ready or being prepared, or not falling short in what I'm going to do next. And so I can watch it doesn't matter how many times I've done something, there's still this kind of buildup. And so a few years ago, it was about 5 years ago, starting doing rain directly with that anxiety. And it was really amazing. And it was really important to me because it was keeping me from, it was more than 5 years ago, it's probably more 8 years ago. It was keeping me from being fully present with my mom, who was living with us at the time. So I did rain with that anxiety, recognizing when it would come up that it was, and I'd name it. I just say, okay, anxious, and allowing, I sometimes use the word, this belongs. It's like saying, okay, this is a wave in the ocean right now and it belongs. It doesn't mean I like it. Allowing doesn't mean I want it to stay there, but it means acknowledging the reality of the moment. I'm pausing. And then the I investigate as I would feel the kind of twist and squeeze inside me. And I might investigate and ask, what am I believing? And the belief is usually, if I don't try harder, if I don't do more, I'm going to fall short, and then people won't love me. It goes really into that deep place. So I would get in touch with that, and then I'd investigate and say, well, what does that part of me really need right now? What's the reminder, or what's the quality of comfort? Because that's a really powerful investigating question. And I often, as I'm doing right now, will put my hand where I'm feeling the feelings, because it helps keep the attention there. And it's actually the beginning of nurturing. I'd listen to, what does that anxious place need? And what it needed was really to trust that my natural wisdom or kindness will come through. And, yes, it's good to prepare, but I'll be fine, to really trust who I am. And so for nurturing, I would in some way say, it's okay, sweetheart. What you need is already inside you. And just doing that process would leave me enlarged. I'd feel more of a sense of that compassion and that spaciousness, and less caught in that anxious small self with those spinning thoughts. Well, I can say that it's not a one shot for most any of us. I do rain many times, but the good news is each time you do it, you get more and more familiar with who you really are. In other words, that sense of that spaciousness and kindness becomes more true and real than any of the stories we tell ourselves about a failing self, or need to perform more or be better. So many, many rounds. And it also gets faster. There's kind of like the thing of, whatever you practice gets stronger. The more I do that, the less I rest in that anxiety. So it really shifted, and it changed my time with my mom. And I wrote about this in the book, that I found when I was with her, as I was taking her on errands, or we were eating our big salads together at night, or going for a walk on the river, I was actually there. I wasn't feeling pulled by that anxious part to be somewhere else. And when she died, just maybe 4 years after she moved here, I didn't have those regrets that I hadn't shown up. So in a very deep way, people tell me rain saved my life. And for me, rain saved my life moments with my mom. And that actually helped. That really is part of what inspired me to write the book.
One of the things you talked about, which I find really interesting, is you talk about creating this openness and this spaciousness for yourself through the practice of rain. You also talk about loving yourself. How are those two things connected?
Well, the reality is that for so many of us, we are in the habit of really being uh, tremendously hard on ourselves. And this is pretty pervasive in the culture. Most people I know have a lot of self-judgment and are pretty chronically feeling not enough, not good enough. I think of that cartoon with a dog on a psychiatrist's couch and saying, it's always good dog this and good dog that, but is it ever great dog? And we are like that. We have this idea of how we should be and we feel like we're falling short. So rain is a really powerful tool for putting down what I call the trance of unworthiness. And this has been for decades a really big issue for me. I remember when I was in college and one of my good friends said how she was learning to be her own best friend. And I realized I was the opposite. I was harsh and cruel with myself, whether I was down on my body or down on how I behaved in a relationship or the kind of work I was doing academically. So I began to explore how to love myself more, how to bring more compassion to myself. And rain is kind of the fruition of that. Because with rain, what we do is we recognize, okay, I am judging myself, I'm being harsh, I'm down on myself, I feel shame. Shame is the deep emotion that goes with it. And we allow it, we let it be there. And then as we start investigating, and I'll speak for myself, I can feel those very core beliefs that something's wrong with me and I'm not okay. The feelings of unlovability, really deep. And if I let myself bring that mindfulness in a comprehensive way to my life, I see how many moments, and I ask this to others, how many moments has the sense of being not enough affected your capacity to be intimate with others, to enjoy what you're doing, to feel creative or risk-taking at work? I mean, it's a real deep ouch when we realize how much life we've lost to the trance of unworthiness. And when I can investigate and feel that sorrow about how often I turn on myself, then I can begin to nurture. And in some deep way, there's a beautiful phrase one healer used, and it's just simply, I'm sorry and I love you, you know. And so for years, I've been putting my hand on my heart when I do this rain process and letting myself get in touch with the feelings of self-judgment and aversion and so on, and landing up with, in some way offering nurturing and discovering, as I described before, that sense, that field of compassion where I'm no longer the judge or the judged. I'm resting in that field of compassion. And that has really freed me from the trance of unworthiness. I don't believe anymore the stories of not being okay. They come up and I can feel anxious, but I don't really believe them anymore. So I've trained many, many people in working with self-aversion this way. And it's probably, when I hear from other people, the biggest thing they tell me is that they have finally found a pathway to self-compassion. And that is so needed in our culture.
Is that why you decided to write the book now?
I decided to write the book because I saw the power of a pathway to both self-compassion and compassion for others. I've been seeing it for years, and I wanted to offer a book that had the kind of capacity to be a real guide in a very practical way. So somebody could read it and say, okay, my particular issue is my conflict with so-and-so, where I'm constantly blaming them or feeling insecure, or my issue is addiction, or whatever it is, and be able to find a way home, find a way back to a sense of presence and kindness.
Can you talk a little bit about the trance of unworthiness and what are some of the hallmarks of that? So maybe folks might sort of say, yeah, that's me, yeah, that's me, yeah, that's me, and that this work is for them.
Many of us swing from feeling special and important, like we're in some way better, to feeling a sense of chronic not enoughness. And we kind of go back and forth between it. But the signs of the trance of unworthiness are really having that inner judge, that voice of criticism that pretty much regularly is sensing that we have not met the standard. And it's very much amplified by the kind of society we're in, where it's very competitive and we're given standards to meet right from the get-go. Our parents, unless they're very awake, have some idea about how we should be to be happy or to reflect them well. And so very early on, we're told, don't be so loud, don't be so needy, be more like this. We have a lot of pressure to achieve in certain ways, academically and at work. We have pressures to have a body that fits a certain prototype that many of us don't fit, and to have features and looks that others, and in education, and this gets me really deeply, our society worships a left brain rational intelligence. And I think of all those kids who don't have that particular kind of intelligence that end up feeling stupid. And so it's such a shame. And then it's exacerbated even more, the trance of unworthiness, by such hierarchy in our society, where we have a dominant culture that gives a message to non-dominant cultures that they're inferior. And the racism in our country, when we think of the impact, what racism really does to the psyche of a young person to grow up and really deeply internalize the message of less than, and how that then impacts everything about their life experience. So I'm kind of going into the societal level, but the upshot is every one of us, if you say, what does a child most need? We most need to be seen, and we most need to be loved. And we need both. If we're seen but not loved, we're insecure. And if we're loved but we're not seen, we can't trust the love. So most of our parents were not awake enough to give that in an unconditional way and in a clear way. So we grew up not trusting we were okay, doubting ourselves. And I think of meditation, and in particular this RAIN practice, as a kind of spiritual reparenting, where we're learning to see ourselves in a clear and honest and good way, and offer the kindness that we needed. And one psychologist, Luis Corzolino, he's a attachment therapist, and he describes that it's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the nurtured. We need a way to nurture the vulnerable parts of our being. And when I think of loving myself, it's not loving a narrative self. It's not loving a story about who I am. It's not inflating. It has no grandiosity. It's simply bringing love to the felt life experience of the moment. And what that allows me to do is that same love is then available in a much more authentic way for all beings. It doesn't discriminate.
So that's beautiful. And thank you very much. I really appreciate how you've put it in context, not just for the individual, but socially, and some of the forces and sources that can make us all feel diminished. And I love your phrase about the survival. It's the survival of, what did you say, the most nurtured?
It's the survival of the nurtured. Yeah.
Survival of the nurtured.
And we can see it actually in the evolution of the species, which is what's so fascinating to me, that, for millions of years, we lived in hunter-gatherer groups, and everyone else that wasn't part of our group was considered other, and it was a bad other, and because it was dangerous. And so they were considered less than human. So the only real affiliation was within our in-group. But about 10 or 20,000 years ago, we had a real spurt in our brain development, and we began to be able to collaborate, to care about beings beyond our kin group. And that has continued to emerge in widening circles in terms of our capacities now, that we really have the capacity in a visceral way to have radical compassion for beings that are not our direct kin. To me, that's the hope of the world. That's what defines it. That's what gives our species its most profound accomplishments, is that we can collaborate, communicate, and care. And those widening circles are what we can facilitate. In other words, and this is what makes it such an amazing juncture in this time of history, is that humans have discovered they can actually facilitate their own consciousness growing. We can actually train the way we pay attention to care more. And to me, the hope of the world right now, because we're in a spike right now of fear, as many know, it's you can see it personally that there's more anxiety reported than ever before. And globally, the spike of fear, it's when we have unprocessed fear in a societal level, it turns to violence, and it turns to tribalism, and it turns to racism. And we're seeing right now kind of an upswing in that dividedness. And in this country, in the United States, the enormity of the contempt that one side of the equation feels for the other. So if ever in history, we need to wake up our caring for our inner life, for each other, for those we don't agree with, for the earth. We will not act in ways that move us towards healing if we don't wake up our caring.
It's very powerful, and you're right. We live in such persuasively or predominantly difficult times right now. Everywhere you turn, there's things that are more than irksome. Just to bring it back down, if you don't mind, to the individual level. It sounds like what you're saying is that when someone practices rain, that they then have, it almost sounds like what you're saying or you're describing is almost like they're creating their own source of love, and that then permeates how they live, and then that radiates out. Is that when you're talking about the circles? Is that
One way to think about it is that when we're stuck, we're caught in feelings of separateness and fear. Anytime we feel emotionally stuck, we'll sense that we do not feel connection with others. Mother Teresa put it that our real suffering is not remembering our belonging. We forget our belonging. And so what helps us remember our belonging is the practices of deepening attention. And we get in touch with the vulnerability inside us, and we bring kindness to it. We start being intimate with our inner life. We reconnect with a more space of compassion. And we make a shift from being in what I call a limbic hijack, where we're caught in fight, flight, freeze in a small self. We make a shift from that to a much more awake, integrated quality of consciousness, where we can attend and befriend. Those are the words used in terms of evolution. That's a higher state of consciousness. That's the state of consciousness that then extends to others and naturally feels, oh, you belong to me too. You are part of me. We're part of each other. And then we act in ways that really benefit the greater good.
So it sounds like you're describing, when you're talking about being in a limbic hijack and fight or flight, it sounds like the process of rain is not only one that affects what you're thinking about and your awareness of your emotions at the time. It sounds like what you're talking about is also a physiological shift. Is that true?
That's exactly right. I love that you put it that way, because neuroscientists have been able to identify the shift. They can see the shift from an activated limbic system to a quieting limbic system, and to an activation of the frontal cortex in an integrated way that really correlates with more positive emotion, with a more relaxed, fluid, capable nervous system. So there are very much physiological responses that go with it. And the shift that we can experience directly affects how we're relating with other people. And I'll give you an example, Anne, because this is a kind of ongoing one. So many people I know are, experiencing what goes on around them in the larger society, and feeling fear, and also feeling a lot of anger and rage and a lot of blame. Blame is really rampant. And so what I've done with what gets stirred up in me when I feel angry and I kind of blame certain individuals that I think are causing suffering to the greater population, is I'll pause and I'll do rain. And the way I do it is I'll recognize, okay, angry, and I'll allow it, because every emotion is intelligent and we really need to give space to every emotion. And then I'll start investigating and feel the anger in my body. And what happens is I discover under the anger that there's fear. And then I feel that fear fully and I allow it to be there and I keep staying with it. And what I find is under the fear, there is a sense of real grief or sorrow for what's happening, and the losses to our earth and to vulnerable populations. So I open to that sorrow, and then under that sorrow I can feel caring. So I actually, it's like an unlayering with rain when I investigate to caring, and then I just bring a quality of full presence and tenderness to that. And what happens in after the rain is I have shifted from an angry, outraged individual to a space of caring. And I'm still completely motivated to act, because I feel like in these times, spirituality really needs to get off the cushion, and we need to have our voice out there, and we need to vote, and we need to bring our healing to the world. But it needs to come from our caring. And if we don't take the time to do rain and process the anger, we will really only replicate some of the things we most are upset about.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And thank you for that example, because I think we're all triggered and feeling anger or anxiety about what we're seeing around us. And I think I'm grateful for you walking us through that, because we do want to come from a place of caring and we do want to repair what is going on around our world, but to do it in a way that comes from a compassionate space rather than a strident space. So thank you for that. Can we just talk for a second? I want to talk a little bit about mindfulness and meditation, and where does mindfulness fit into rain?
Well, it's the grounds of rain. Recognize and allow really is the foundation of mindfulness. To be mindful in the present moment, you need to recognize what's going on without judgment, without tampering with it, with an allowing quality of presence. So the foundation of rain is to begin right there and just notice what's happening. And that's also considered to be the foundation of compassion, because if we really get in touch with what's happening, if we really get in touch with vulnerability, this is the dynamic of meditation. If you really get that you're suffering, you really sense that, ouch, there's a natural tenderness that arises. So rain is a courageous practice because it uses mindfulness to directly contact what's going on, so we can then feel that tenderness. And with nurturing, when we actively extend care, that actually brings the quality of compassion into its fullness. The site of compassion in the frontal cortex is very near to the motor cortex, which is why compassion actually is intended to bring forth activity. So when we say, oh, it's okay, I care about this, sweetheart, or whatever the phrase is, or whatever we're doing, we're actually manifesting a more full and more empowering compassion.
So it sounds like also what you're saying is, in the process of rain, because as I'm hearing you describe it, you're describing different levels of awareness, that you may be angry and that then you discover that that's fear, and then you sort of go through another level. How it sounds like part of the role of mindfulness there as well is not getting caught up into the stories. Is
Mm-hmm.
that true? So
Yes, and that's why we let the investigations really meant to be primarily somatic, because you start with the story. We're not trying to get rid of the story. Let's say I am in conflict with my husband, and how am I going to use rain? I'm sitting here blaming him, and I'm believing my thoughts that he did that and he shouldn't have done this, and why didn't. So the practice of rain, and by the way, I'm giving you a real example because every couple has stuff going on. So for instance, some years ago, we used to have tension around, we'd have a time we were going to sit together during the week. And often I'd find that he in some way, something would interfere for him and he wouldn't be available or whatever. And I would get really upset and judgmental. And so what I learned to do with that is I would step aside, and there are all these stories about what's going on, and I'd recognize, okay, judging, and I'd allow what was there to be there. But then as I'd start to investigate, and this is a U-turn, I'm going from stories blaming him and I'm making a U-turn to investigate, because that's my favorite way of describing it. I'd start finding under the judgment or anger, there was a feeling of being hurt. And then I'd just sit with the feelings of being hurt, and I might sense the belief there, well, if he really cared about me, he would have prioritized or whatever. But I keep coming back to the felt sense, because our issues are in our tissues. You know, it's not until we bring a presence and a kindness to the actual feelings in us that we start discovering the space and awareness that's larger than the story. So we need to keep coming into the body. So I'd feel the hurt, and I'd feel the sense of kind of the unlovable feelings. And part of me would go, oh, unlovable, I know that one. And then I'd bring kindness to myself. And when I can do that, you know, and really rest in after the rain and sense who I really am, that compassionate presence, and know that all the stories and feelings move around like the surface waves on the sea, but I'm bigger than that, then I can begin to look at him through more awake and wise eyes. And then I can look at him and sense and recognize what's going on for him more, and allow it, and even investigate and sense, well, what might be under that for him? You know, there's a really wonderful question, which is, you know, how does this hurt for you? You know, what hurts? What's hurting? You know, and there's a story I sometimes share, Anne, that I'll share with our listeners right now, where if you're walking in the woods and you see a tree and a little doggy under the tree, and you go to pet the dog, and then it lurches at you and its fangs are bare, and it's, you know, all of a sudden you go from feeling friendly to really being scared or angry. But then you notice that the dog has its leg in a trap. And then you shift again from angry to, oh, you poor thing. Now you might not go over and pet it because it's dangerous, but your heart has shifted because you've seen what's behind that unacceptable behavior. Well, when we do rain, we begin to touch the vulnerability behind the behaviors. We sense it in ourselves. We sense, oh, I acted that way because I was feeling unlovable, because I was feeling hurt. Or I can look at him and saying, oh, he's acting defensive because when I'm aggressive like that, he feels unsafe. You know, and I can start seeing better, and then my heart opens. And then when we talk, and because he's doing the same processing I'm doing, we can name with authenticity the vulnerability. And instead of staying in the reactive dance, we can each open our hearts to each other in a much more direct way. So I'm sharing with you these more personal stories because there is such power to stepping out of our patterning and recognizing and allowing and investigating and nurturing. It allows us to open to more of the truth of who we are and live from that.
I was going to say, it sounds like the work allows us to open up to that, to see it, to feel it, and then to embrace it, so that you can have a conversation that isn't about he said, she said, but is actually about I feel this, and you can recognize your hurt and say, I was hurt when this happened, and then you have a much more rich and loving conversation.
So that's exactly right. Yeah.
A couple more questions for you, if you don't mind. Really, just really two. What is the most common sort of rain experience that people have shared with you, just so that our listeners can think, yes, this is the one I have too. So if you don't mind, could you just share what is just a common emotional state that people come to you with and how you've worked with them through the steps of RAIN to come to a resolution.
Yeah, well, in a way, I find three common ones, and one of them is kind of the anxiety or fear one. And that for many people, if they can sense the anxiety and fear is there and actually not fight it so much, allow it to be there. For one woman, when she got in touch with it, her fear place, and she said, "What do you need from me?" What that fear place needed was to accept that I'm here. And when there are waves going on in our ocean and we just let them be the waves of the moment, they act that right away, saying this belongs, creates space. And that's what it did for her. So there are different ways. And the other response with fear, the other nurturing is, I'm here, I'm not leaving, in some way to give a message to that vulnerable place that you've got its back, you care. And it doesn't make the fear go away, but it creates a larger space that we're inhabiting. It's like that metaphor where if you put dye into the water in a sink, it turns whatever color it's meant to turn very brightly. But if you put that same amount of dye in a lake, you don't notice it. Well, we become more lake-like when we let what's there belong. The second really common one that people bring to me is what we talked about earlier, Anne, which is a sense of self-hatred or self-judgment or self-aversion. And for many people, it's when they investigate and sense, I ask the question, how long have you been feeling this? And so many people tell me, well, it's as long as I can remember, as long as I can remember. And then they'll feel that sense of that soul sadness at seeing the whole landscape of their life and begin to offer themselves kindness. And if they feel too regressed to offer themselves kindness, and this is an important point with nurturing, sometimes we can't self-nurture. Sometimes we're too young and too small and too regressed in that moment. It's totally fine to call on nurturing from a larger source. So for myself, at times I felt so stuck in being bad that I've called on loving presence in the universe to kind of wash through me and embrace me. And when we really reach out with sincerity to a larger source, we'll find it's there. I know for myself, at times I've gotten to the deep depth of investigating and the voice that's there says, please love me. Just please love me. And I'm kind of reaching out to the whole universe. And if I really say those words, I feel that washing through of tenderness and care and light through my being. And then as I relax into it, I realize that loving presence is who I am, but I needed at the time to reach out. So reaching out for nurturing is really valuable. And I often teach people how to do that. We each have our own way. That's an example of where we need to customize. And I have a lot of examples of that in the book, Radical Compassion. The final place that people get caught is in blaming other people. They know that they're stuck in anger, and there's a deep intelligence in us that knows that as long as we're caught in blame, our hearts are armored. We know that. And yet it's really hard to let go. So I teach a lot about rain on blame and ways that we can, it's got its own organic timing, but ways that we can have the intention to forgive or let go of blame and find a tremendous amount of freedom in that process. The last thing I'll mention on this is that when there's a lot of trauma, we have to do the process differently. Because if we go directly into the RAI, we can re-traumatize. We can recognize, okay, there's a lot of fear here, allow it, then we start getting really shaky. And if we begin to investigate in our bodies, we can get re-traumatized. So for many people, I say start with the N. Flip it around, start with nurturing. Nurture, find some pathways of nurturing that make you feel really as loved and safe as possible, and keep using those, even if you have to do it for weeks or months or years. Because when there's trauma, we need to feel safe, or safe enough before we can then do the full RAIN process. And I also encourage people to do RAIN with a therapist or a healer. So there are different avenues that different people need to use, and for many people now, people are doing rain as partners, and they have a rain partner, and they do it together and share at different times during it. I have a lot of free material on how to do the protocol with a rain partner, but that helps to create a safe and stable container, and it helps to keep our attention with the process, and it creates intimacy with other people. So it's a beautiful kind of co-meditation.
That sounds very powerful, and I love the idea of creating intimacy. And it sounds like intimacy and honesty and that sort of trusted network of somebody who can really see you at your most vulnerable and also your most loving. Because it sounds like each time you peel back these layers, you're getting closer to this sort of loving and authentic core of your being.
That's exactly right. They get to see, and you get to share both the vulnerability and the goodness. And to be honest, it's not like we always go through the 4 steps and feel vavoom, this glow. Often we get cut and we have cut off, or something gets stuck, or we have to rerun it. And that's okay, because anytime we intentionally pay attention to what's going on, we're interrupting the old habits and beginning to create the new neural pathways and all the different levels that allow us to become free. So I really encourage patience, because the old patterns for years have been replayed and replayed. So we need to take our time with it and be really gentle in the process.
Well, it also sounds like the more you nurture yourself. I mean, I feel like that when you were describing the addition of nurturing in dealing with trauma, it sounds like we can all use that in, a lot more of the time. And it sounds like also, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like it also becomes an active, like a sharing with others of that end. You can recognize and allow and investigate perhaps what other person's point of view is, but it also sounds like the end just becomes your sort of natural, hopefully, disposition towards others.
That's really the truth of it. In a way, I think of rain as it shifts our identity from a small self that often doesn't know how to love without holding back. We hold back our loving. And so by with a lot of practice, we're resting in a much more spontaneously affectionate and creative and courageous quality of presence. And that comes out in our relationships with others. And it really naturally comes out. This the shift in identity is the gift, going from a small separate self to that much more spacious field that we get to actually live from loving presence, live in our moments from loving presence.
Well, that's actually my final question for you. Because in the preface of your book, you ask the question, what does it mean to live true to yourself? And so, how does rain help each of us discover that? That's such a critical question.
Yeah, well, in a way, we start with where we're not living true to ourselves, because whenever we're not living true to ourselves, there's some kind of suffering we feel. And we feel the disjunct. And I know for many people, at the end of the day, they look back and feel a disappointment that they were reactive or on automatic, and didn't really show up, often lashed out. And so we start with where we're in reaction. And that's a wake up. Most of us, I mean, the way we start doing rain is we notice, oh, there's friction, there's discomfort. And then we start breaking those patterns. And it's really, Rumi said not to seek for love, but to seek for the blocks we've created against it. So we start sensing those blocks and undoing them with rain, so that our natural loving can flow through.
And I would also imagine that not only can your natural loving flow through, but if you don't have the fear, and maybe the fear are the blocks that prevent us from expressing ourselves, that then we're in this place and sort of spaciousness or expansiveness where we're able to then express ourselves because we're not either in old patterns or confined, we're actually able to be out in the world more as ourselves.
That's exactly right. That we have more of a fearless heart. I mean, fear is the block. When we're feeling separate and identified, we are the body musculature is tighter, our heart is armored, and so what Rain is doing is helping us to wake up out of that. And it's not an all of one's thing. And every one of us every day forgets. I mean, we all it the whole spiritual path is remembering and forgetting and remembering and forgetting. But the more we practice, and Rain is nothing new, Rain is simply a weave of mindfulness and compassion. But the more we practice these kind of trainings, even when we're forgetting on some level, there's still a remembrance of what it truly means to be at home. And that has a gravitational pull that gets stronger and stronger.
So, Tara, thank you so much. Can you lead us in a practice of rain?
Oh, I'd love to. We'll call this a light rain, okay? And I invite all who are listening now just to make yourself comfortable, however possible. Come into a posture that's at ease. Close your eyes. You might take a few long, deep breaths to collect the attention. And allowing your breath to resume in its natural rhythm. You might sense if there's anywhere in your body just to let go a little bit. Shoulders, the hands, just softening your belly and feeling a quality of presence right here and now. Take some moments to scan through your life and choose some situation where you sense you get emotionally stuck, where you get reactive in a kind of regular way. Not something traumatic that won't serve you right now, but some place where you get annoyed or irritated or start judging and blaming, or maybe you feel hurt or defensive or act out in some addictive way or get anxious about what's around the corner. So some reactive situation where you'd like to have more accesses to your true nature, to your strongest resources. When you have a reactive situation in mind, go right into it. In other words, see closely what room you're in or where you're located when this reaction's coming out. So you're getting a particular example in mind, and just if there's another person involved, see their face and hear the words that are being said. And whatever is going on, as if you're watching a movie, stop it at the frame where you feel most triggered. And this is where we begin, Rain, to recognize whatever's most predominant. You might be recognizing anger or judgment, fear, whatever it is. You might just mentally name it, note it, and then have the intention to allow it. And by that, I mean just to create a space where it can be as it is. This is the pause where you're letting the life here be. You might even say, this belongs right in this moment. And that can give you an entry to investigating a little and sense, where is it living in your body? You might feel your throat or your chest or your belly. So you notice what's going on a bit. And it can help if you ask, well, what am I believing when this is happening? Am I believing that somebody wouldn't act that way if they cared about me? Or am I believing I'm failing in some way? Or that I'm unlovable? Or that I'll never change? And just notice if there's a core belief. And notice when you're believing that belief, how does it feel in your body? What's it like when you're really believing that belief? And see if you can sense where you feel most vulnerable, most reactive, most hurting, most upset. And you might even put your hand there. It'd help to put your hand maybe on your throat or your heart or your belly. And so you're keeping company right now, feeling that feeling. And you might even let your face express what you're feeling, because that can help you get in touch with the feeling. Maybe even your posture changes a little, your shoulders go forward, or your other hand clenches, whatever it is. Breathe into where you feel most vulnerable and ask that vulnerable place, how do you want me to be with you right now? What do you most need? And listen from your most awake high self, from your full awareness, from your heart. What does that place need? Does it need love? Is it saying, please love me? Does it need forgiveness? Does it need that you just allow that it's there? Does it need company? Does it need to know you're staying with it? And as you listen, sense how you might respond to this part of you. Feel the touch, and this is a good time, if you haven't already, to experiment with placing your hand on your heart or on your own body, and let the touch be tender, and let the touch communicate care. And you might sense if there's a message that you can offer to that vulnerable place that could bring some healing. For some people, it's simply, it's okay, or it's okay, sweetheart, or I'm not leaving, or you can trust your goodness. And if it's hard to offer yourself a message, bring to mind someone who loves you, who you trust. Might be a grandparent, might be a child, might be your dog, might be a spiritual figure, might be formless quality of presence that fills the universe. And let the love and the wisdom of that larger being, let the compassion wash through you. And really let it in right now. Feel that it's flowing through your hands, right into your body, right into your heart, right into the vulnerability that's here. This is nurturing. Notice what happens if you let in. You let in love. And for these last few moments, noticing the quality of presence that's right here. Whether it's just a little bit of space that's opened up and a little bit of perspective, or a deeper shift, a shift from a small, separate self that might have felt victimized or reactive to a more spacious sense of presence and compassion. Resting in that presence and trusting that you're becoming more who you really are every time you deepen attention to what's going on inside you. You might take a few more full breaths, and as you're ready to open your eyes, welcome back, and thank you for having the courage and the willingness to experiment with rain.
Wow. Thank you so much. That is a beautiful practice. I just feel like melted butter. Very different from how we began. Thank you so much, Tara Brach. Really appreciate all the wisdom, kindness, and guidance that you bring. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. A total pleasure to be with you.